To discuss this and the South African situation is Greenpeace's Melita Steele. Good morning to you, Melita. Thank you for coming in. So, is this a sign of just how bad things are going to get climate-wise?
So I think scientists are really debating how much of the polar vortex phenomenon is related to climate change. But what is related to climate change is extreme weather events. And so things like the heat waves in Australia, the water crisis that we saw last year, and potentially also these massively freezing temperatures in the US are actually a symptom of climate change that is already happening.
Talk to me about the polar vortex concept. I can barely pronounce it. What is it all about?
So the polar vortex is basically a whirlpool of really freezing air that circulates above in the Arctic, the northern pole. And what happens is that vortex actually collapsed and influenced the jet stream, which is another sort of channeling of air, which then caused the very cold temperatures to flow into the US. So the breakdown of the polar vortex does sometimes happen, but not always.
Here at home, I mean, we here in Gauteng have had some frightening thunderstorms in the last while. Is that also part of a worsening climate situation?
So things like thunderstorms generally would not necessarily be related to climate change, but more extreme thunderstorms, so where we're seeing things like serious flooding happening, that would potentially be a symptom of climate change. I think that the thing to bear in mind is weather is what you see outside your window, and climate change is the long-term changes that are happening to the weather, the sort of average that is happening. And that's basically where the global temperature on average is rising, which then drives these extreme weather events.
What are we to do as far as solutions are concerned in the context of that Paris Climate Accord, where we know the United States under Donald Trump has pulled out? He doesn't believe certainly in the concept of climate change and global warming. How effective can that accord continue to be? And do you think that there is proper and thorough implementation of that agreement going forward, given that climate change is indeed a race against time?
It is very much a race against time. So the International Panel on Climate Change released a report last year, and they basically advise governments on climate change. And they said we have essentially 12 years to act to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. If we don't act in the next 12 years, we're actually going to start to see catastrophic climate change, which would make what we're seeing right now look like a Sunday picnic. As far as Donald Trump is concerned, the science is clear. Scientists, almost 90% of scientists agree that climate change is real and that human beings are causing climate change. So people like Trump are an anomaly, and they actually get too much bandwidth in the media in terms of their questions around climate change. In terms of what is being done and the Paris Agreement sets a good baseline for action. But the report that I was referring to actually clearly indicates that we actually need to become much more ambitious. So in South Africa, almost all of our electricity comes from coal. And burning coal to produce electricity drives climate change, but also creates massive air pollution, which then damages people's health. So Greenpeace believes that the most urgent thing that needs to happen is a shift away from coal and towards renewable energy. In terms of whether we've got that right, no, we haven't.
Before we conclude our conversation, I want to talk about something I was reading in the week about wetlands and how they can act as shock absorbers of some kind as the situation continues to deteriorate. Do we have sufficient wetlands in South Africa, and are we tapping into them as we should if we want to be able to protect South Africa from the most serious effects of climate change?
So things like wetlands do actually act as shock absorbers. So do things like forests, and so do things like the oceans. So all of those are acting to mitigate the things that we are doing to drive climate change. The unfortunate problem is not only are we driving climate change, but we're cutting down the forests, we're building over wetlands, we're overfishing the oceans. So even those shock absorbers are under extreme pressure. ultimately, the key thing that needs to happen in South Africa is that we must shift away from coal. Eskom relies almost entirely on coal to produce electricity, and we really need to invest in renewable energy for a better future.
Why aren't we moving fast enough in that regard? Because this is not a new message. For the past, decade to 2 decades, the message has always been we need to move toward renewable energy, but it's not moving at as quick a pace as the likes of Greenpeace would like to see.
We would absolutely like to see 100% renewable energy in South Africa. And in fact, South Africa has some of the best renewable resources in the world. Unfortunately, we have a lot of vested interests in both coal and nuclear. There's a lot of money behind both of those things, which are blocking the changes. But you can see around the world that coal is a dead end. And in South Africa, the sooner that we wake up and start pushing for renewable energy, the better the future is going to be.
Melita, thank you so much for your time. That was Greenpeace Africa's Melita Steele speaking to us here on ENCA Now.